They had never fired at a living target before. Most of them had pulled the trigger maybe 3, 4 times during training. Now, through the dust and morning haze of Sicily, they watched death approaching. German armor, the Hermann Göring division, Tigers among them, 56 tons of steel death, engines roaring like approaching thunder. Behind those metal beasts, seasoned infantry who'd marched across Europe, leaving conquered nations in their wake. And between those advancing tanks and the American soldiers still splashing through surf barely a mile distant, stood a scattered line of paratroopers holding weapons most had never even seen 2 months earlier. Metal tubes, 5 feet of hollow steel. A weapon so new it didn't have a proper name yet, just a nickname borrowed from a comedian's musical prop. The Bazooka. This is the story of how 2 army officers, a scrap pile, and 30 days of desperate manufacturing changed warfare forever. July 11th, 1943, outskirts of Gela. The paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne pressed themselves against ancient stone walls, watching the horizon darken with approaching vehicles. 19 hours earlier, they'd dropped from transport planes into Sicilian darkness, scattered, disorganized, lost. Now they'd found something worse than confusion. They'd found the enemy. Colonel James Gavin, gathering his fragmented force near Biazza Ridge, understood the mathematics immediately. No artillery support worth mentioning, no armor of their own, just rifles, determination, and these strange tube launchers that had arrived in crates nobody knew how to open. If those panzers reached the beaches, thousands would die in the surf. The invasion, everything, could collapse right here on this dusty Mediterranean road within the next 60 minutes. The noise grew louder, tank treads grinding rock, diesel engines growling, German voices calling coordinates. The panzers rolled forward with the confidence of predators who'd never met resistance they couldn't crush. Why would they fear? For 3 years, infantry had scattered before them like leaves before storms. Poland fell in weeks. France collapsed in 40 days. Across Russia, entire armies evaporated when the panzers arrived. These were the masters of mechanized warfare, and everyone knew it. Everyone except perhaps these American paratroopers who hadn't gotten the message about running away. Gavin gave his order. Let them approach. Hold position. Wait. Turn the clock back 2 years. 1941. Before any of this seemed possible. Back when an infantryman facing a tank had exactly 3 options available. Flee, hide, or die. Those were the choices, and they were all terrible. Consider the numbers. A single Panzer III weighed 20 tons. Its 50mm cannon could obliterate anything human-sized from hundreds of yards. Machine guns swept entire fields clean of advancing soldiers. Armor plates laughed at rifle rounds, at grenades, at everything infantry carried. One tank could break a company. A platoon of tanks could shatter defensive lines that had held for weeks. The psychological damage ran deeper than the physical threat. Soldiers who saw tanks coming simply ran. They knew their weapons meant nothing. They knew standing their ground meant certain death. Some tank crews reported rolling through positions without firing because everyone had already fled. What could infantry even try? Anti-tank rifles existed, massive weapons that looked like rifles designed for giants. The German Panzerbuchse 39 fired tungsten core rounds that might penetrate 25 millimeters of armor if you got close enough. 5mm rounds. Both weighed nearly 40 pounds. Both required exposed firing positions, kneeling, prone, making yourself an easy target for tank machine guns. And both were becoming obsolete as armor grew thicker. By 42, anti-tank rifles couldn't even scratch frontal plates on newer German tanks. Towed anti-tank guns worked better. The American 37mm, later the 57mm, could penetrate armor from reasonable distances. But these weapons demanded tow vehicles, setup time, careful positioning. Once emplaced, they couldn't relocate quickly if tanks changed direction. Gun crews sat exposed to enemy fire. The guns themselves were heavy, expensive, available only in limited numbers. Not something you could issue to every squad, not something that gave individual soldiers fighting chance. The most common method for infantry to kill tanks was also the most suicidal. Get close. Place explosives by hand. Some armies issued magnetic mines you could stick to hull plates. Others developed improvised charges soldiers could throw or place manually. All required approaching a vehicle that was actively trying to kill you with machine guns and cannon fire. Survival rates were catastrophic. Studies conducted after the war estimated fewer than 1 in 5 soldiers who attempted close assault on tanks lived through the experience. For every tank destroyed by infantry rushing forward with explosives, 3 or 4 men died, sometimes more. American military planners recognized this gap as existential. The Panzers had crushed Poland in less than a month. They'd broken France with its fortifications, its large army, in 6 weeks. They'd driven deep into Soviet territory, capturing millions. Everywhere armor went, infantry scattered. The United States Army desperately needed a weapon that could give ordinary soldiers the power to stop tanks, needed it to be portable, light enough for 1 or 2 men, needed it simple enough that draftees with minimal training could use it, needed it cheap enough to mass produce, and needed it powerful enough to penetrate modern tank armor. In 1941, no such weapon existed anywhere on Earth. The solution emerged from a cramped workshop at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. 2 officers, minimal resources, almost no funding. Major Leslie Alfred Skinner, West Point class of 24, had been obsessed with rockets since childhood. As a 15-year-old living on a military base in 1915, young Leslie had experimented with homemade rockets. One experiment went spectacularly wrong, set fire to the base hospital roof at Fort Strong, Massachusetts. His father, an Army surgeon, banned all further rocket experiments. The fascination never died. Skinner studied at West Point, qualified as an airship pilot, eventually landed in the Army's rocket research program. By 1940, he was running a program that barely existed. No funding, no staff, no clear direction. His entire team consisted of himself and 1 assistant. Second Lieutenant Edwards Ewell, 24 years old, fresh from Lehigh University with an engineering physics degree, joined the Army in 41, assigned to Ordnance Corps. Brilliant and utterly inexperienced in weapons development. Together, they'd been tasked with finding a way for infantry to deliver shaped charge grenades against enemy armor. The shaped charge itself wasn't new. Principle discovered decades earlier, hollow out an explosive charge, line it with metal, and detonation produces a concentrated jet of superheated gas and molten metal that punches through armor like a blowtorch through butter. The Army already had shaped charge grenades. The M10 could penetrate several inches of steel, enough to defeat most tank armor. But the grenade weighed nearly 4 pounds, too heavy to throw accurately, too heavy to fire from a rifle like standard grenades. The only practical use required soldiers to physically run up and place it on enemy tanks. Skinner and Ewell needed another delivery method. Months of experimentation followed. They tried rifle grenade launchers, grenades too heavy, tried small mortars, too bulky, too slow, tried mounting shaped charges on small rockets, building on research the legendary Robert Goddard had conducted during World War I. The rockets worked. A small solid fuel motor could propel the shaped charge to effective ranges. But rockets created a deadly problem. When ignited, they produced a jet of flame and hot gases shooting directly backward. Any soldier firing such a weapon would be burned by his own exhaust. Flame could ignite clothing, cause severe burns, even kill the shooter. They experimented with different rocket designs, propellants, ignition systems. Nothing solved the exhaust problem. The rocket had to vent hot gases somewhere, and wherever those gases went, they endangered the soldier. Spring 1942. Lieutenant Ewell was walking through a scrap pile at the testing facility, thinking about the exhaust problem, when he noticed a discarded metal tube. About 5 feet long, 60 millimeters in diameter, exactly matching the grenade diameter they were weaponizing. Ewell stared at that tube and suddenly understood. If you put the rocket inside a tube, if the tube was long enough, the rocket motor would finish burning before emerging from the front. Exhaust gases would vent safely out the back behind the soldier. The rocket would fly out the front toward the target. The tube would act as launcher and shield simultaneously. It would direct the rocket straight, improving accuracy. It would protect the shooter from exhaust. And it would be light, simple, cheap to manufacture. UHL grabbed the tube from the scrap pile and ran back to the workshop. Found Skinner, explained his idea. Within hours, they'd assembled a crude prototype, mounted the tube on a simple wooden shoulder stock, added basic sights improvised from wire bent from a coat hanger, loaded one of their experimental rockets and connected ignition wires. The first test firing was conducted with Ewell wearing a welding helmet and heavy gloves in case the tube exploded. He knelt, aimed at a target, squeezed the trigger. The rocket ignited with a whoosh. Flame and smoke vented harmlessly out the back. The rocket flew straight, struck the target, detonated with a sharp crack. The shaped charge punched a clean hole through steel plate. It worked. The tube design solved every problem they'd struggled with. The weapon weighed barely 13 pounds. 2 men could operate it, one aiming and firing, one loading. It could deliver a tank-killing shaped charge over 100 yards. So simple it could be manufactured quickly and cheaply in enormous quantities. They'd created the world's first practical shoulder-fired anti-tank rocket launcher. May morning, 1942. Skinner and Ewell took their prototype to Aberdeen for formal demonstration. A competitive trial was organized testing various infantry anti-tank weapons, primarily spigot mortars, considered the most promising approach. By coincidence, or perhaps not entirely coincidence, Major General Gladian Barnes happened to be present. Barnes was Chief of Research and Engineering in Ordnance Department, one of the most important officers in the entire weapons procurement system. He was touring the facility with several senior officers when he noticed strange commotion at the rocket launcher test range. Flames, whooshing sounds, clouds of smoke. Barnes and his party came to investigate. They found Skinner and Ewell firing their crude tube launcher at a moving tank target. Despite improvised coat hanger sights, rockets were hitting with remarkable accuracy. 5 different spigot mortars being tested simultaneously had failed to score a single hit on the moving target. Skinner recognized his opportunity. Taking a calculated risk that could have ended his career if things went wrong, he handed the launcher to General Barnes and offered to let him take a shot. Barnes accepted, shouldered the weapon, aimed at the moving tank, fired. The rocket hit the tank squarely on his first try. Barnes was delighted, fired again. Other officers wanted to try. Within minutes, they'd fired every available round, laughing and exclaiming at the power and accuracy of this strange weapon. Barnes looked at the tube and commented, it reminded him of a musical instrument he'd seen in a comedy act, a bizarre creation called a bazooka played by radio comedian Bob Burns. The nickname stuck instantly. Despite its official designation, the weapon would be known as the Bazooka. General Barnes didn't wait for committees or studies or lengthy procurement processes. The weapon was ordered into immediate production. General Electric received a contract to deliver 5,000 launchers and 25,000 rockets in 30 days, one of the fastest weapons development contracts in American military history. Engineers at General Electric worked around the clock. Production lines established at the Bridgeport, Connecticut facility. The launcher design was simplified for mass production, keeping the basic tube configuration but replacing wooden stock with metal, improving sights, adding safety features. General Electric met its deadline. By mid-June 1942, 5,000 bazookas were ready for shipment. But the weapon was so new, so secret, almost nobody outside the development program knew it existed. No training manuals, no instruction films, no experienced instructors who could teach soldiers how to use it. The bazookas were packed in crates and loaded onto ships. The soldiers who would use them had never seen anything like them. First bazookas arrived in North Africa, September 1942. 600 launchers shipped to British forces in Egypt for potential use in the Western Desert Campaign. When British commanders tested the weapon against the captured Panzer III, the bazooka rocket penetrated frontal armor cleanly. But the British decided desert terrain offered too little concealment for such a short-range weapon. A soldier would have to get within 200 yards across open desert where any movement could be seen for miles. The British stored their bazookas and didn't use them in combat. American forces received their first bazookas during Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa beginning November 1942. But distribution was chaotic. Crates arrived at supply depots with labels quartermaster officers didn't recognize. 36 in M1 meant nothing to soldiers who'd never heard of such a weapon. General Dwight Eisenhower, commanding the invasion force, was shocked to learn on the night before landings that not a single soldier in his invasion force had received any training with the bazooka. The weapons were there, packed in crates, but nobody knew how to use them. Officers had to figure it out through trial and error. They opened crates, examined the strange tubes and rockets, experimented with loading and firing procedures. The early M6 rocket ammunition was notoriously unreliable. Some rockets failed to ignite when the trigger was pulled, others ignited but failed to achieve full thrust, dropping short of target. A few detonated prematurely in the tube, injuring or killing the soldiers firing them. Despite these problems, the bazooka began proving its value. Reports filtered back from Tunisia of German tanks being engaged by infantry with shoulder-fired rockets. Kills were few at first, limited by unreliable ammunition and untrained crews, but the psychological impact was significant. American soldiers who'd been taught tanks were nearly invincible suddenly had a weapon that gave them fighting chance. The Germans noticed immediately. Intelligence officers analyzed reports from Tunisia with growing concern. American infantry was using some kind of new rocket weapon that could penetrate tank armor. The weapon appeared portable, carried by individual soldiers, could be fired from concealed positions with no warning. Tank crews who'd grown accustomed to infantry fleeing now faced an enemy that might stand and fight. Late 1942, early 1943, German forces captured several intact bazookas from American units in North Africa and from Soviet forces who'd received some through Lend-Lease on the Eastern Front. The captured weapons were shipped back to Germany for immediate analysis. German engineers disassembled the bazookas, studied their construction, measured components, tested performance. They recognized immediately that Americans had achieved something revolutionary, not just another anti-tank weapon, a new category entirely, a shoulder-fired rocket launcher that could kill tanks and be carried by a single soldier. Within months, German industry began producing its own version. The Raketenpanzerbuchse, better known as the Panzerschreck, entered production in 1943. German designers made significant changes, increased the warhead diameter from 60 mm to 88 mm, giving greater armor penetration, replaced the electrical battery ignition with a magneto generator, eliminating concerns about batteries failing in cold weather on the Eastern Front. But the larger warhead and heavier construction made the Panzerschreck more cumbersome than the American original. It weighed over 20 pounds. The rocket motor produced enormous amounts of hot exhaust, continuing to burn several feet after leaving the tube. Operators had to wear protective ponchos and gas masks to avoid being burned by their own weapon. A protective shield had to be added to the launcher to protect the shooter's face. The fact that Germany immediately copied the bazooka tells you everything about its impact. The Germans weren't accustomed to copying enemy weapons. German military technology was generally considered superior to Allied equipment. German tanks, aircraft, weapons were the standard against which others were measured. The Wehrmacht's engineering prowess had produced the Tiger tank, the Me-262 jet fighter, the V-2 rocket. German industry was a source of national pride. But the bazooka filled a gap German designers hadn't solved. They recognized the American design was superior in important ways. It was reusable, allowing a two-man team to fire multiple rockets without discarding their launcher. More accurate than the Panzerfaust, with sights allowing aimed fire at moving targets, could engage targets at greater range, keeping soldiers further from deadly machine guns mounted on tank turrets. By copying and enlarging the bazooka, Germany acknowledged that Americans had achieved genuine breakthrough in weapons technology. The age of infantry hiding from tanks was ending. The age of infantry hunting tanks had begun. Back in Sicily, that morning of July 11, 1943, the soldiers of the 82nd Airborne were about to demonstrate what that change meant in practice. The paratroopers had jumped into Sicily during the night of July 9th-10th, preceding beach landings. Their mission was to seize key terrain, disrupt German communications, prevent counterattacks against invasion beaches. But the airborne operation had been badly scattered. High winds blew transport aircraft off course. Many paratroopers landed miles from designated drop zones. Units were fragmented across Sicilian countryside, small groups of lost soldiers trying to find each other in darkness. Colonel Gavin, commanding the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, spent pre-dawn hours gathering scattered paratroopers. By morning, he'd assembled several hundred men near the key crossroads at Piazza Ridge, overlooking routes German reinforcements would use to attack invasion beaches. Gavin's force was badly outnumbered and outgunned. No tanks, no artillery support beyond a few packed 75mm howitzers dropped with them. Their anti-tank capability consisted of a handful of bazooka teams equipped with newer M1A1 launchers and improved M6A1 rockets that had better reliability than earlier ammunition. When German tanks appeared on the morning of July 11th, rolling toward vulnerable beaches, Gavin faced a stark choice. He could withdraw, let the tanks pass, preserve his force, but possibly doom the entire invasion. Or he could fight with inadequate weapons and untested soldiers against one of Germany's elite armored divisions. Gavin chose to fight. The tanks belonged to the Hermann Göring Division, a Luftwaffe Panzer unit that had fought across North Africa. Battle-hardened veterans and well-maintained tanks supported by experienced infantry. Among their vehicles were Tigermarsch tanks from Schwere Panzerabteilung 504, massive heavy tanks that had terrorized Allied forces since their introduction in 1942. The Tiger was a monster. Weighed over 56 tons, dwarfing American Sherman tanks that weighed barely 30. Its 88mm main gun was the most powerful tank cannon in the world, capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges exceeding a mile. Its frontal armor was 100mm thick, effectively impervious to most Allied anti-tank weapons. American tankers had been warned that engaging a Tiger from the front was suicide. Against these behemoths, Gavin had paratroopers with rifles, a few light artillery pieces, and bazooka teams with limited experience firing their weapons at actual enemy tanks. Gavin ordered his men to let the tanks come close. The terrain around Bazooka Ridge offered advantages infantry could exploit. Stone walls bordered fields. Olive groves provided concealment. Farmhouses and outbuildings created strong points. A force that knew how to use this terrain could hurt an enemy that tried pushing through without proper reconnaissance. The paratroopers spread into positions maximizing their advantages. Bazooka teams were placed where they could hit tanks from sides and rear where armor was thinner. Riflemen and machine gunners positioned to keep German infantry away from bazooka teams. Pack howitzers dug in to provide direct fire support. The German tanks advanced confidently. They were accustomed to infantry fleeing before them. Across Europe, soldiers had learned that standing against tanks was futile. The Americans would run as others had run, and the tanks would roll through to the beaches. But the Americans didn't run. When the first panzers entered the engagement zone, Gavin's men opened fire. Machine guns raked German infantry. Mortars dropped rounds among advancing soldiers. And from concealed positions throughout the battlefield, bazooka teams began engaging tanks. Rockets streaked across the Sicilian morning and slammed into hulls. Not every shot penetrated. The original M6 rockets could penetrate about 60mm of armor, roughly 2.5 inches, sufficient against sides and rear of most German medium tanks, but inadequate against frontal armor or the heavy Tigers. The improved M6A1 rockets performed somewhat better. Bazooka teams had to aim carefully, targeting thinner armor plates, tracks, engine compartments. Not every hit disabled a tank. Some rockets struck at bad angles and deflected away. Others penetrated but failed to cause critical damage, but enough rounds found their marks to throw the German advance into chaos. The psychological effect on German tankers was profound. They'd expected to crush these scattered paratroopers in minutes. Instead, they were taking losses from weapons they'd never encountered in combat before. Rockets were coming from multiple directions. Every stone wall, every building, every patch of vegetation could hide a soldier with a bazooka. Tank commanders began to hesitate. The confident advance slowed. Crews that had been pressing forward aggressively became cautious, scanning constantly for hidden threats. The fear of an unseen rocket fired by a concealed soldier from close range changed how the Germans fought. The battle at Bazooka Ridge continued through morning. Germans pushed forward. Americans fell back to new positions. Fighting swirled across the ridge. Both sides took casualties. At times, the outcome hung in balance, but the German armored advance never achieved the breakthrough it needed. By afternoon, reinforcements from the beach began reaching Gavin's position. American Sherman tanks joined the fight. Artillery support became available. The balance shifted. The Hermann Göring Division withdrew to regroup. The American beachhead was secure. The battle at Bazooka Ridge wasn't a decisive victory in traditional sense. It was a delaying action, a desperate stand by outnumbered paratroopers. But it demonstrated something new. Infantry equipped with bazookas could fight tanks and survive. The old equation where armor always defeated infantry no longer applied. Word spread through German armored units. American infantry now carried weapons that could kill tanks. The old tactics of simply driving through infantry positions no longer worked reliably. Every hedge, every ditch, every ruined building could conceal a soldier with a bazooka. Tank commanders had to assume anti-tank rockets could come from any direction at any time. By the time American forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the bazooka had become standard infantry equipment. Every American rifle company was equipped with them. Soldiers had trained extensively on their use. The improved M9 launcher with its magneto ignition had replaced the battery-powered M1 series, eliminating problems with dead batteries and unreliable electrical connections. The newer M6A3 rockets could penetrate up to 4 inches of armor, significant improvement over original ammunition. The bocage country of Normandy, with its thick hedgerows and narrow lanes, was ideal terrain for bazooka ambushes. Every field was enclosed by ancient earthen banks topped with dense vegetation grown for centuries. These hedgerows weren't simple hedge fences. They were substantial barriers, sometimes 6 feet thick and 8 feet tall, with root systems so dense even tanks had difficulty breaking through. German tank crews found themselves in a nightmare landscape where visibility was measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. Every field entrance was potential ambush point. Every hedge could conceal an enemy. And American soldiers with bazookas had learned to use this terrain with devastating effectiveness. Bazooka teams adopted tactics maximizing their advantages. They'd hide in hedgerows, allowing tanks to pass, then fire at vulnerable rear armor. They'd position themselves at field entrances, waiting for tanks to commit to pushing through narrow gaps where they couldn't turn or maneuver. They'd work in teams with multiple bazookas, engaging the same target from different angles. Technical Sergeant Van T. Barfoot of the 45th Infantry Division demonstrated what a skilled and courageous soldier could accomplish with a bazooka during the Italian campaign. May 23, 1944, near the town of Carano. During the breakout from Anzio beachhead, Barfoot's company was defending positions when 3 German Mark VI tanks attacked. Barfoot assessed the situation with veterans' calm. He'd been fighting since Sicily. He knew what bazookas could and couldn't do. Knew engaging heavy tanks required getting dangerously close and aiming precisely at vulnerable points. He grabbed a bazooka and ammunition, moved to an exposed position directly in front of advancing tanks. While his comrades took cover, Barfoot knelt in the open, presenting himself as a target, and waited for tanks to come within effective range. From just 75 yards, barely more than a football field, Barfoot fired his first rocket. The round struck the lead tank squarely on its track assembly. The track shattered. The massive tank ground to a halt, unable to move. The other 2 tanks began turning toward flanks, seeking to outmaneuver the threat. As they moved, the crew of the disabled tank opened hatches and attempted to escape. Barfoot dropped the bazooka, grabbed his Thompson submachine gun, and killed 3 German tankers before they could reach cover. But Barfoot wasn't finished. Leaving the disabled tank and its dead crew, he worked his way behind enemy lines, moving through battle chaos to reach a German artillery position. Using explosive charges, he destroyed an artillery piece that had been firing on American troops. On his way back to American lines, Barfoot encountered 2 wounded American soldiers. Despite being alone in territory still contested by German forces, he helped both wounded men back to safety, carrying and supporting them over 1,700 feet of dangerous ground. For his actions that day, Van Barfoot received the Medal of Honor, the highest award for valor the United States can bestow. The term contained both admiration and grim humor. Everyone understood that earning a Medal of Honor often meant dying in the attempt. Bazooka teams had to get close to their targets, had to expose themselves to return fire, had to hold positions while multi-ton armored vehicles bore down on them. Casualties among bazooka teams were severe throughout the war. The weapon gave infantry a chance against armor, but it was a chance paid for in blood. Staff Sergeant Isidore Jochman of the 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 17th Airborne Division, demonstrated the courage bazooka duty required during the Battle of the Bulge. January 4th, 1945, near the Belgian town of Flamiers, Jochman's company was pinned down by German artillery, mortar, and small arms fire. Then 2 German tanks appeared and attacked, inflicting heavy casualties among exposed paratroopers. Jochman watched his comrades being killed and wounded around him. The tanks were methodically destroying his company. Without anti-tank weapons in position, the paratroopers had no way to fight back. Without hesitation, Jochman left his covered position and dashed across open ground through a hail of fire. He grabbed a bazooka from a fallen comrade and ammunition from another soldier. Then he advanced directly toward the attacking tanks. The tanks concentrated fire on him. Machine gun rounds tore up the ground around his feet. Tank main guns swung toward this single soldier running at them with a tube on his shoulder. Any reasonable calculation said he should have died in the first seconds of his charge. But Jochman kept running. He reached effective range, aimed, fired. His rocket struck the first tank and damaged it enough to force withdrawal. The second tank, seeing what happened to its partner, also pulled back. Staff Sergeant Jockman was mortally wounded during this action. He died shortly after saving his company from destruction. His Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously. Jockman was one of only 3 Jewish American soldiers to receive the Medal of Honor during World War II. At least 6 of his aunts and uncles had perished in the Holocaust. He'd volunteered for the paratroopers specifically because he wanted to fight the Nazis. In his final moments, armed with nothing but a bazooka and extraordinary courage, he'd stopped German tanks from killing his fellow soldiers. By the end of 1945, American factories had produced 428 bazookas of all types, along with over 15 million rockets. This massive production effort involved multiple manufacturers beyond General Electric. The weapon had been distributed to every major Allied nation through Lend-Lease and direct military aid. Free French forces received over 11,000 launchers. Britain received thousands more. The Soviet Union received 3,000 bazookas. Smaller Allied nations also received them. Brazil approximately 2,900, China about 2,000, Canada roughly 170,000 units. The weapon became truly global, fighting in every theater of the war. The industrial achievement was remarkable. In May 1942, the bazooka didn't exist as a production weapon. By war's end, nearly 500,000 had been manufactured along with enough ammunition to supply years of intensive combat. American industry had taken a prototype built from scrap and turned it into one of the most widely produced weapons of the war. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Ewell, the young engineer who'd spotted the tube in the scrap pile, went on to a distinguished career after the war. He rose to senior positions in aerospace industry, eventually becoming president and chairman of Fairchild Industries. In that role, he oversaw development and production of the A-10 Thunderbolt II aircraft, a modern tank-killing platform continuing the mission he'd helped pioneer with the bazooka. UHL died in 2010 at age 92, remembered as the father of the bazooka. Colonel Leslie Skinner continued his Army career afterward, working on rocket weapons development. His work contributed to guided missiles and portable rockets that would equip American forces in decades that followed. He died in 1978, largely unknown outside military circles, despite having helped create one of the most influential weapons of the 20th century. The bazooka itself continued to evolve. The original 60mm weapon was replaced by the M20 Super Bazooka with its larger 89mm warhead. When American forces faced Soviet-built T-34 tanks in Korea, the original World War II bazookas proved inadequate against heavier armor. The Super Bazooka had to be rushed to the front to give infantry a fighting chance. But the fundamental principle that Skinner and Ewell proved in 1942 remained valid and remains valid today. A single soldier, properly equipped, can destroy a tank. That revolution in infantry capability continues through every generation of portable anti-armor weapons, from the Dragon missile to the Javelin to systems not yet deployed. German tank crews who faced bazookas in Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany learned lessons that armored forces have relearned in every war since. Tanks are not invulnerable. Heavy armor doesn't guarantee survival. Infantry equipped with the right weapons can fight back against any armored vehicle. That transformation from invulnerable war machine to vulnerable target began in a scrap pile at an American proving ground when a young lieutenant noticed a discarded tube and had an idea. That's how innovation happens in war. Not always through committees or lengthy development programs, sometimes through urgent necessity, 2 officers in a workshop, 1 insight from a scrap pile, and 30 days of frantic production. That combination of need, creativity, and industrial capacity changed the balance of power between infantry and armor forever. The paratroopers at Piazza Ridge didn't know they were making history. They were just trying to survive, trying to stop those tanks from reaching the beach, trying to protect their brothers still wading through surf a mile away. They held metal tubes on their shoulders and aimed at 50-ton monsters rolling toward them through dust and heat. Some of them died doing it. But they stopped the tanks. They proved that infantry could fight back. They changed warfare itself, and it all started with a piece of scrap metal and an engineer who saw what others had missed. Not just a discarded tube, but the future of combat. Sometimes the most powerful weapons aren't born in laboratories or designed by committees. Sometimes they come from desperation, inspiration, and the courage of soldiers who refuse to run when death approaches on treads of steel. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to keep these forgotten chapters of history alive. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Whether you're in Texas or Tennessee, California, or Carolina, you're part of a community that believes these stories matter. These men mattered. Their courage mattered. And as long as we remember, they never truly die. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for keeping history alive.